Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And we're getting started with our Global Tree Dialogues INC-4 Digest. Thank you so much for joining us today. Next slide, please. Please stay tuned as the INC-4 Digest will begin shortly. We're currently letting everybody into the room. As you join the meeting, please mute yourself, but turn on your video and do get comfortable. You can open the chat box, tell us where you're coming from, and this is an interactive forum, so we definitely want to hear from you. So feel free to engage through the chat. And also, please rename yourself with your full name and organization. You can do that by hovering over your picture and clicking on the three dots in the top right corner, selecting rename. Please do so that we can identify you. We really appreciate you joining us today. We'll take a few more minutes as everybody's still entering the room. We'll now start moving towards our welcome and agenda overview. Next slide, please. So hi, everyone. My name is Marta Ficina. I'm a CEO at OPLN, and we'll get started today with a quick welcome and agenda overview to let you know what's just ahead of you and all the things that we're going to learn about. Please, next slide. So starting today, we'll open the digest with remarks from Jyoti Madhur-Philip, Executive Secretary of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, INC, at UNEP. This will be followed by a digest and overview from Christina Dixon, also campaign leader at EIA. Her remarks will be followed by a presentation from SAP, our partner, on why data is essential to advancing plastic waste and mitigation. From there on, we'll jump into a panel discussion, starting first with member states and following by stakeholder dialogues. And we'll finish off today's digest with a keynote presentation from Yanni Shiran, a partner at Systemic, who will present Plastics Treaty future work and their latest report. Next slide, please. So today's digest and all the digests that we have done so far since INC1 were organized with support of SAP, our partner. Thank you so much for continued support over the INC process. We very much appreciate this as a part of this informal forum. Next slide, please. So Global Tree Dialogues were really founded on the margins of UNEP 5.2, and they were designed to bring together all sides of the plastic crisis to the table. So today we'll have an opportunity to use this informal forum to discuss together with the stakeholders the outcomes and progress accomplished during INC-4 in Ottawa earlier last month. Next slide, please. So as you can see on the roadmap, we're now reaching the last INC or working towards the conference in Busan that is scheduled for November of later this year. Today, we'll specifically focus on the outcomes and progress when we'll hear the reflections and perspective of both UNEP team as well as member states and stakeholders in participation. This is an open forum. You're welcome to comment and provide your insights in the chat box as the conversation continues. Please, next slide. We also want to take this opportunity to share with you some of the work we've been doing with the United Kingdom government, specifically working on the National Tree Dialogues on Plastic Pollution. We've been organizing these multi-stakeholder convenings since INC1 with aim to inform the negotiation team on multi-stakeholder perspective and provide a platform where all stakeholders across the plastic ecosystem can communicate on the key priorities for the UN Plastics Treaty. Next slide, please. And now I'm very honored to welcome our special guest today, Ms. Jyoti Mathur-Philip, Executive Secretary at UNEM. Jyoti, please welcome.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. And I hope you can hear me well. Yes? Okay, yes, cool. Yes. So it is my real pleasure to be with you all today. And a very, very special thanks to the Ocean Plastics Leadership Network for your kind invitation. Very few days have passed since the conclusion of INC-4. And let me stress at this time that conversations like this are keeping the momentum going and elevate the importance of continuing the discussion on the INC process, and especially as we go towards the road to Busan. Allow me to provide a few points on the outcomes of INC-4. During the fourth round of negotiations, members of the committee made steady progress in advancing the text of the instrument. Textual negotiations commenced at INC-4 based on the validated text by co-chairs and co-facilitators. And at the request of the committee, the Secretariat will issue a compilation document drawn from the 5 non-papers prepared by the INC-4 subgroups, which reflect the latest progress of the text. This compilation document will be the starting point for the last round of negotiations in Busan at the end of this year. Also, through active discussions, the committee agreed on a way forward for intersessional work and decided to establish 2 ad hoc intersessional open-ended expert groups. The first group will develop an analysis of potential sources and means that could be mobilized for the implementation of the objectives of the instrument, and including options for the establishment of a financial mechanism and alignment of financial flows and catalyzing finance. The second group will identify and analyze criteria and non-criteria-based approaches with regard to plastic products and chemicals of concern in plastic products and product design, focusing on recyclability and reusability of plastic products, considering their uses and applications. A mouthful, but we will all start unpacking it very soon. And this is all for the consideration by the committee at its 5th session. In addition, the committee decided to establish an open-ended legal drafting group, which will conduct a legal review of any elements of the draft text with a view to ensuring that the text is reflected in a legally sound manner, and make these recommendations on language to the plenary for its consideration. So in 7 days, a massive amount of work was indeed carried out by the committee. During the session, we also had 3 thematic side events, and which fostered dynamic and engaging conversation amongst participants, and I hope a number of you joined them. We already know that over 480 in-person participants engaged in the side events. The active and constructive participation of all actors in the last session demonstrates your commitment and willingness to reach an agreement by the end of this year. Ottawa witnessed the involvement of thousands of participants, larger than any other INC session to date. More than 2,500 delegates attended, representing 170 members and over 480 observer organizations, including non-governmental organizations, intergovernmental organizations, and UN entities. The participation of observers in the last session increased by almost 50%. I personally felt inspired by meeting many new and previous INC delegates across the halls of the Shaw Center, all the tireless effort that everyone is putting into this work is a true example of the commitment to this process and a pledge to tackle plastic pollution. I am in awe of by the non-stop dedication of the delegates of members of the committee and observer organizations, some of you who are here today, which despite the very, very late hours, you were always present and dynamic in the room. As we head to the Republic of Korea in November, let me also highlight the continued engagement of all stakeholders in this process. In the spirit of the Resolution 514, all stakeholders play a vital role in driving attention to plastic pollution and amplifying the discussions beyond the negotiation spaces. You are at the forefront of the issues. Your voices, including of the most vulnerable youth, Indigenous peoples, women, and waste pickers, are very much needed. I look forward to the rich and insightful conversations from the panelists and speakers today. And as the club...
I think we're having a little bit of an internet issue that we're dealing with. Let's give it one more second. I'm very sure that Jyoti Mather-Philip will be joining us shortly back to listen to the panel discussions and other presentations that we have prepared for today. But in the meantime, we will get moving with the next section of the presentations for today from Christina Dixon, Ocean Campaign Leader at EIA. Megan, please go.
Hello, my name's Chris Dixon. I'm the Ocean Campaign Leader at the Environmental Investigation Agency based in the UK, and I'm just back from Canada from INC-4, and I've been asked to give you a little bit of a rundown about what happened. And believe me, quite a lot happened in Canada, but I will try to keep this sort of fairly high level and just give you some of the highlights from my perspective. So without further ado, I'll just take it away. So just as a reminder, this is where we are on the timeline for the negotiations. So we've just completed INC-4 and we're rapidly hurtling towards INC-5 in Busan, South Korea later this year. That is the fifth and final round of negotiations for a new plastics treaty. So the timeline now is kind of hot under pressure. There's a lot of work to do if we're going to conclude negotiations by the end of 2024. What happened at INC-4 then? So there were over 2,500 participants, and the way that the work was divided, basically what you have in negotiations is something called a contact group. So the work was divided into two contact groups. Those contact groups take place under Chatham House rules. So whilst they're open to observers, you can't, for example, report on which specific country said this or that. But that is where the real negotiations happen. So you have the plenary then breaks into these contact groups, and then in this INC, we also had subgroups within the contact groups that were divided along topical lines. So these subgroups, there was never any more than two happening at once, and they were basically progressing the negotiation of the text. When we arrived at INC-4, we had a revised zero draft, which stood at over 70 pages long. And that revised zero draft still contained lots of different options, and it wasn't really a text for negotiating. If you remember, we finished INC-3 without a mandate for a first draft of the text to be prepared. So we essentially picked up where we left off with this large compendium of ideas for what a treaty could look like. And that was the challenge for INC-4, is to try and streamline that and turn that into something that looked a little bit more like a treaty and had real text up on the screen to negotiate. I think one of the big outcomes from my perspective is that we did start to really hear and see what countries want to see in the new treaty. So it wasn't just kind of high level positions, it was actual discussion of text. And we want this, we don't want that. Quite a few countries submitted what's called conference room papers. So these are CRPs, and they're often proposals about different ideas. So sort of to help advance the conversation beyond the text negotiation. And we saw some quite interesting CRPs, for example, on chemicals and products. We also saw one from Rwanda and Peru, where they tried to articulate what a global target on plastic production reduction could look like. They put out the idea of 40 by 40, so a 40% reduction by 2040. I think that's really impressive that now we're moving towards like a genuine exchange of ideas, people putting out content to then consider as member states. However, we did also see many member states still saying they want no option at all for some of the provisions. So although a lot of time was spent developing the text, member states were still saying we'd rather see no text at all. We don't want a provision on, for example, production or on polymers of concern. There were calls to focus on the so-called low-hanging fruit, so areas of convergence, things like waste management, legacy plastics. And so whilst there might be more alignment on those topics, many member states also felt that to focus on only those areas of convergence and try and make progress there at the cost of, for example, dealing with the upstream aspects, that would be a disservice to trying to meet the objectives of the instrument, because many member states feel that we can't address plastic pollution without dealing with plastic production. So this kind of divergence of views is something that kind of characterized the tenor of the negotiations throughout the week. So this is just an example of what a text now looks like. So I think it was Fiji in their closing remarks on Monday night at about 3 a.m. said, we need to break free from black brackets. So brackets are basically when someone puts a bracket around the text, it's like that text doesn't exist anymore. So they don't want that there anymore. And this is a text on primary plastic polymers, and it is just a sea of brackets. So the challenge now for negotiators at INC-4 will be, how do we get rid of some of these brackets and find agreement? And that is going to be really difficult. What were some of the main outcomes of INC-4? So there was an agreement for intersessional work. Intersessional work is the work that would happen between now and INC-5, and we didn't have a mandate for that coming out of INC-3. And many member states were insistent that we couldn't leave INC-4 without a mandate for intersessional work. Unfortunately, the mandate is a little bit vague. It contains some sort of vague language around discussion of criteria and non-criteria based approaches for chemicals in products and product design, thinking about recyclability and reusability. So it will be a kind of expert process, likely to take place over a week, perhaps in the summer, and that is just to advance some of the technical work to inform INC-5. The discussion on intersessional work did become a little bit of a proxy for the elements that people wanted to see in the treaty as a whole. So, for example, over 50 countries were asking for production to be included as part of the intersessional work, in particular a proposal to produce a report looking at production volumes. And this was ultimately dropped in the attempt to have a compromise on a package of intersessional work that could move forward. Nobody wanted to basically blow up the intersessional work package. The downside of that is that the areas where we most need intersessional work, for example, on production, now hasn't been included in the mandate. So that was pretty unfortunate. There is going to be intersessional work as well on means of implementation. So in other words, this is the financial aspects. And this is quite a detailed aspect of the programme for intersessional work. So similarly, this would be an expert process to inform the work on finance going forward. One of our main concerns is that we could have a really great discussion on finance and implementation, but we won't have any provisions to implement because there isn't agreement. So sounds dark, but that's kind of where we're worried about things going if we don't move forward on some of the more challenging substantive conversations. Good things that we landed with coming out of INC-4 is that we do actually have a negotiated text. There were attempts to not negotiate on some of the provisions, particularly primary plastic polymers, but in the end, due to some expert co-facilitation, we negotiated all of the provisions throughout the week. So that means we do have a streamlined text, which is much shorter than the revised zero draft, and it does contain everything that should be in the treaty and is up for discussion. That means that everything remains on the table. This idea that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed is particularly true here. So all of the provisions are still out there. It's a document that everybody owns. Everybody's had a chance to input into it, and now the kind of process of refinement can begin. We do have over 3,000 brackets though, so it's going to be really difficult to negotiate this text. And there are still many elephants in the room. If we're not able to have a substantive conversation about production, I think that finally started to happen this week. But with it still being a topic of divergence, there are still a small group of countries that don't want production in the treaty, and that's effectively sort of holding back progress on this topic, particularly when it comes to, for example, intersessional work. So production is still the big elephant in the room. What we did see, though, is a declaration launched on the final day of negotiations, the Bridge to Busan, which is now open for signatories until Busan later this year. And I think at the time of recording, there's 31 countries and a bunch of stakeholders signed up to this declaration. And the declaration is basically a declaration on primary plastic polymers, saying we really need to be able to have a conversation about this and really highlighting how integral production is to the overall conversation of plastic pollution. So that was really fantastic to see, and I think that galvanized a lot of momentum throughout the week. Other kind of just little snippets, gossip from the ground, things that I thought were quite interesting in Ottawa. So we did see a huge lobbyist presence, particularly from plastics producers. This increased by a third compared to the last round of negotiations. And we also saw a lot of these adverts. So from the moment you landed at Ottawa Airport, there were sort of pro-plastic adverts, which is something I've never seen before. And I think that sort of signals a bit of a change in the dynamics in the negotiations. Clearly, a lot of money is being invested in promoting plastics, actually. So that's quite interesting. The other thing, considering that we were in Canada, was that there was a big Indigenous presence and really a lot of attention to putting Indigenous voices front and centre in the negotiations. And something that was very impactful for me was seeing one of the First Nation communities highlighting the state of emergency in their community happening, right now during this week, where there was an emissions leak from a plastics productions facility that was poisoning their community. So really bringing that real world evidence into the negotiations to say, plastics emissions are directly harming Indigenous communities. So I think that was a very powerful element to bring into this context. And besides that, I was really proud to be part of a huge delegation of civil society organisations from all around the world. And it was just fantastic to work with so many technical experts who I feel are bringing real value to the negotiations. So that was a whistle-stop tour of INC-4. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Chris Dixon, and thank you so much for engaging in the chat at the same time. And now we'll be moving forward with our next speaker of the day, Stephen Jameson with SAP, who will be talking about why data is essential to advancing plastic waste mitigation. Please take it away.
Thank you, Marta, and well, hello everybody. I think some of you met in Canada in Ottawa the last couple of weeks. Some of you new, so good to be with you today. If you go to the first slide. So I'm Stephen Jameson. I'm head of circular economy solutions here at SAP, and been collaborating as part of this ecosystem for the last 6 years or so, as we've been sort of finding our way collectively to the solutions and the interventions that will ultimately get us to an end to plastic pollution by the year 2040. What I wanted to do today is give you a little bit of insights from an SAP standpoint. You may wonder, why SAP? What's the relevance here? Well, as we know, so much of what we're talking about here, we're talking about the processes, the systems, the businesses that interact with, that purchase, that manufacture, that dispose of this material on a day-by-day or an hour-by-hour basis. Many of those businesses are our customers. We've been working across, or something like 84% of global commerce will touch an SAP system at some point. And so a very high proportion of this plastic material is touching our systems, and the interventions that are necessary in order for us to operationalize a treaty like this is very core to our hearts. Our customers have been depending on us for over 50 years to help them govern their business on a global basis. And this UN treaty is a new opportunity area for businesses to really embrace change. So if you go to the first slide. I'll just point out as well, as part of this, I'm also representing the Business Coalition for Global Plastics Treaty. We're part of this sort of high ambition group where we believe a set of global rules are what will help us ultimately accelerate the change we need in order to deliver upon its ambition. But whilst we represent this sort of globally ambitious, let's call on this slide, proactive group of stakeholders, at the end of the day, we have 400,000 customers around the world, 80% of which are small to medium-sized businesses. And so whilst we need to support the sort of the raising of the ambition and how we support those organizations that are really driving the thin end of the spear here, our role as SAP is also to help operationalize this at the absolute ground level and to be able to support businesses of every size, in every market, in every geography, to be able to really operationalize this ambition. If we go to the next slide, what we see coming out of Ottawa as we go towards Busan is, as we just heard on the last session, everything is still on the table. And what we see as a system provider and as part of the business coalition are really these 5 key topics. We've heard so much about the importance of design and having a consistency in how we design for recyclability, for example. We've heard about the need for harmonization around extended producer responsibility and the need for a globally coordinated effort in terms of how that's constructed. We've understood in the last few weeks the importance of chemicals of concern and the work now going forward for intersessional work. And also the role that transparency plays in terms of shining a light on the data gaps that exist in terms of the waste system and how illuminating those data gaps can help the great term, investment follows data. If we can help illuminate those gaps, then we can help capital flows invest in those spaces where we know infrastructure is needed in order to help drive this change. And also we know new markets are needed around recycled content. And that's where traceability is so important in terms of how we can get that visibility on the waste system and on the plastic system in order to see the true value of these materials as they flow through the ecosystems that the business ecosystems that we are working with. So as SAP, we're looking at all of these topics and we're sort of working through many different collaborations, how to make this real. And if we go to the next slide, what we see is really the need to do these 3 things simultaneously. On one level, we need to be engaging in these forums and understanding what's happening in terms of the sort of societal action space. What are the new regulations that we're looking at? But critically, business needs to measure. Business needs to be able to understand the data that they have within their 4 walls, be able to shape that in a way that can be acted on, enabling business action. And what we know is we hear of the lack of data. We know this data exists. It's there within the organization. It's just how we make the rules such that we can drive transparency, drive disclosure, and enable that collaboration that can unlock and help enable change. If we go to the next slide. So a little bit busier, but this is essentially where we're coming from as an organization. So through our sustainability portfolio, we're innovating in key areas. I've picked out kind of 3 product areas that are really driving this change for us and for our customers. But this is on one hand, how we're utilizing our suite of global solutions and our extensive network to really operationalize extended producer responsibility. And we've done everything from Europe, the most advanced European regulations, eco-modulation in the UK, for example, through to Spanish plastic taxes. And we know that with the upcoming regulations in North America, for example, over the next 12 months, and then the potential for global scope, this isn't a question of innovating new ways of doing things. This is a question of scaling what's already there. And for product compliance, we've been doing this for 30 years, looking at chemicals of concern, helping our business customers to be able to identify where chemicals are used in products and how to either exclude or ban those things, or how to make sure that they are appropriately dealt with within their supply chain. And so again, this is not a question of innovating new solutions. This is a question of leveraging existing mature capabilities, mature technologies, and making that available for use against this process. And there are some new innovations where we're looking at supply chain transparency. We're having to look across very complex, segregated supply chains, where we're looking across multiple levels of stakeholders to be able to look at things like the recycled content of plastics. And we've been innovating things like SAP Green Token to do just that, to be able to track that recycled content. So we're looking across this full domain, enabling these kind of key topics and really helping to not just support the business community through this change, but really help propel the change that's needed across this, or enhance the conversation that needs to happen as we go through to INC-4 and get the right measures through towards supporting a high ambition treaty. And then just the final slide, just to bring it to life. This is some, just as one example, our great customer Henkel have been looking at this in a lot of detail and investing in those key data topics that they can use across these multiple purposes. We just need to give business that bit of direction across these domains, and then the actual, figuring it out across that complexity of packaging and logistic systems, we can take care of behind the scenes. But, this is exactly what our customer Henkel are doing at the moment. So with that, I want to just, wrap it up. And if anyone would like to get in touch, then either through OPLN or directly to me on the email here, or circulareconomy@sap.com as well isn't one other way. So thank you very much.
Please go ahead. Thank you, Stephen, so much for this presentation. I will be discussing in more detail data and monitoring and transparency shortly with our member states. So today we are very honored to welcome 5 different representatives from Federated State of Micronesia, United Kingdom, Indonesia, Samoa, and United States, who will provide detailed insights into the INC-4 process, as well as what's ahead of us right now in the next couple of months. And without further ado, we will start today with Mr. Dennis Clare, who's representing the Federated States of Micronesia. Dennis, can you hear us? Hi.
I can.
Wonderful. Well, we really want to talk to you about specifically today about the bridge to Busan. So I think a lot of discussions happening around the bridge to Busan, a lot of momentum, a lot of signatories, over 20 of 25, I think, right now. If you could give us a little bit more of insights into the means and purpose of this initiative, and then also how this initiative can facilitate collaboration among member states in this critical time.
Sure. Well, thank you for having all of us. We are big fans of the UNEA Resolution 514. We think it's an impressive thing to have achieved. We think that the goal stated in it of ending plastic pollution is a worthy one. And we think that the approach to doing so by addressing plastics across the full life cycle is the right approach. So we want to stay committed to that because we like the objective and we like the approach. Since then, we've also learned new data about production of plastics and the projections and what their impact on the climate system may be. And it's clear that plastic has a major impact on the climate system as well. In the climate negotiations, there's an effort to not address the full life cycle of plastics according to the mandate. There's an effort to push the measures more downstream. We want to make sure that production is a key part of how you address plastics. We think that it's important because of the scope of the plastics problem. You have to address all the elements of the life cycle, but we also think that when you have a treaty and there's a balance of efforts among many countries, the balance of efforts across the life cycle is also a way of taking an equitable approach toward the goal of ending plastic pollution. So we're very concerned about the effort by those upstream, those who make some of the most money off of plastics, to continue to overproduce plastics and not address the production phase of the life cycle. So the Bridge to Busan effort was an effort to say yes to the question of, do we need to keep production in the treaty? And the countries that have signed on are very much in favor of keeping elements of production in the treaty, even though they don't necessarily have the same in-game approach. They want to keep this in the treaty. There are some loud voices that would like to take it out, but the effort was to show that despite the adamance of the few voices that would like to remove production, the numbers of voices that would like to include it are large. I think with the European Union expressing their intent to join as a whole, in addition to the members that have joined already, that would put those on the declaration at about 50, as we have, I think, about 20-some non-EU members right now. We think that will continue to grow. A couple of countries have joined since the ending of INC-4, but we want to keep production on the table. It's important to achieve our climate goals. It's important to achieve our pollution goal, and it's important to achieve equity in the approach to achieving the pollution goal. And in that sense, it's very similar to the Bali and Bangkok declarations on how to deal with the transition away from HCFCs. Back in 2010 and 11, there were a similar group of countries opposing action under the Montreal Protocol to deal with HFCs. And we showed in those declarations first 90 countries and then 117 countries in the Bali Declaration a year later that we did want to take action. And I think the similarity is not just that there's a few blocking countries and a large number of countries that want to take action. The similarity is also in the case that you have something that's overproduced in factories. There are very few number of factories producing it. And if you go upstream to deal with it there, it's much more efficient and cost effective than waiting until these things enter the environment. And similar to plastics, the HFCs don't break down. So they're very similar in terms of negotiating strategy. And it's a very similar situation in terms of if you want to have something, if you want to have less of something that you make a lot of, you want to go to the source and make a little bit less of it. It's a very simple principle. Obviously, those who make money off of the manufacturing are less interested in that approach, but we think it's a necessary approach to achieve our goals. We think it's necessary to have an equitable outcome. And we think that many more countries than oppose the idea are in favor of the idea. So that's the gist of the Bridge to Busan. We have other priorities, including finance and chemicals, but maybe I should leave it there for now.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you so much, Mr. Clare. But we would like to take just maybe 2 minutes to hear a little bit more about, aside of the primary plastic polymers, which I think you have well described the urgency for, what are other priorities and strategies that Federated States of Micronesia will be spending time on right now?
Sure. So our minister focused in his statements in Nairobi on 3 issues primarily: the production issue, the chemicals issue, and the finance issue. For us, obviously, as a small island state, there's a lot of remediation to be done, but we know that that remediation does not end if you don't put a stop to how much is made and if you're not careful about what's going in the stuff that's made. So we're concerned about overproduction, we're concerned about chemicals, and then of course, like all developing countries, we're concerned about having the means of implementation to achieve whatever we're going to have to go achieve. All these countries want to be ambitious, but we need adequate means of implementation. And again, I think here we look to the example of the Montreal Protocol. Micronesia started with a proposal into INC-2 to have a fund like Montreal. At INC-2, we got 8 countries on board. At INC-3, we got to almost 70. And at INC-4, we're now hearing over 100 countries calling for a financial mechanism with a dedicated fund that would look somewhat like the Montreal Protocol and that would also have support from supplementary sources. So we're focused on the production, the chemicals, and the support for developing countries.
Thank you so much, Mr. Clare. And we'll hear a little bit more about that shortly. In detail questions with Dr. Julius Piercy, negotiator with United Kingdom. Hi, Julius. How are you? Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you perfectly.
Wonderful. So we'll take it from here. So at previous sessions of the INCs, a significant number of members emphasized the need for the future instrument to address problematic plastics and also detailed technical discussions regarding problematic plastic products. So could you provide us with some of the key takeaways from the proposal that United Kingdom and Thailand has put forward specifically on problematic and avoidable plastic products?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's really important, right? Without, addressing problematic plastic products, it seems like the most obvious thing that you would try to address within a treaty. And so hopefully this is one of the ones that we will definitely get through. So there's to start from the beginning, really, where this started off. I think the UK has been calling for intercessional work now since INC-2 in Paris last year. So for quite some time, we finally got it. But it didn't mean that we were sitting on our hands doing nothing in between. So we saw there was a real need to start some discussion on the problematic plastic products. We set up some informal dialogues together with Brazil, both between INC-2 and INC-3, and then again between INC-3 and INC-4. So this conversation has now been going on for quite some time, and in it we really got experts from around the world, you know, dozens of experts representing the geographies of the UN system, really, to start, you know, discussing what criteria are needed in order to identify what products are actually problematic. And so the proposal that you mentioned is something that we put forward together with Thailand at INC-4, and it sort of builds on all this work that we've been doing with experts for over the past year, really. And I suppose the best way to explain it is that there's a two-tier approach. So it has both problematic, so it's looking at both problematic and avoidable plastic products. And one set is for those products which are both problematic and avoidable. And those are the ones that we're trying to identify as, you know, the types of things we could phase out or ban. So that's a stronger global issue, and there are a number of criteria that sit beneath that, and I'll go into that in a moment. But then you've got, you know, the products that are problematic, but they're not globally avoidable, because we recognize, you know, there are lots of differences between countries. What might be avoidable in the UK might not be the same as what's avoidable in Kenya. So we've got differences there that we need to recognize. There needs to be some flexibility in the instrument, and therefore some flexibility around the type of action that you take. So that for those products that are then problematic, but unavoidable, you might consider another set of measures to reduce the amount, or to redesign them in a way that makes them less problematic. So just to give an idea then of, you know, what is actually problematic. So I think this is where there are two key things at play here we've identified in the criteria, and those are, first of all, that to be problematic, then either needs to be a demonstration of harm, so inherent harm within the product itself, or, you know, the second part is actually that it's likely, you know, to be littered, or to enter the environment, particularly enter sensitive environments, so environments that are already predisposed for harm. And so that would be sort of how you get, there's a lot of sub-criteria and things in that, and I encourage you to read the paper, which has been uploaded on the INC website as well now. But just to make it short, there's a second part, which is obviously what is avoidable. And then these are the kinds of, the criteria here are, first of all, you know, is it essential? That's the obvious thing. So do we actually need it in our day-to-day life? And can it be replaced or redesigned? So to give you an example of, these are just examples at the moment of, and they all depend on sort of what processes, what countries and experts decide when actually going through this, the potential products to add to the lists. But just to give you a sense or flavor, I think something like stirrers or microbeads in rinse-off cosmetic products are probably meet both the criteria for being problematic and avoidable. But then something which, something like straws or carrier bags, those are things which there might be, you know, some places which although they're problematic, they are unavoidable in certain circumstances. And so there might be other measures that countries can take in order to reduce this overall. So hopefully that gave a brief overview, but, you know, happy to take any questions, but it's up on the website. There's an explainer to go with it as well, in case my garbled intervention didn't make much sense.
No, absolutely. And we actually got the link to the text in the chat for those that want read carefully about the specific examples that are actually mentioned at the end of the paper. It's available there in detail. Thank you for bringing those forward. And speaking of, avoiding the problem to start with, right? So Julius, if you can tell us a little more about addressing product design, including product and material substitution. How does UK recommend for that to be addressed in the treaty text? If you can give us some insights on that, that'll be really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think on product design, this is really another area which is really ripe for some wins, right? So if we're designing the products in the first place to match the system which they're in, then we can start encouraging the movement up the waste hierarchy to not only reduce them, then also incentivize reuse or enable better recycling. Now, having said that, although it sounds easy on the front of it, it's actually quite complex. I think this is something that even some of the most advanced developing countries in this area are grappling with at the moment. What criteria can you put on product design? Now, I've sort of mentioned a bit about the problematic plastic products. I think that's more within the reduce space. But if you go next onto the waste hierarchy, the next thing you have is reuse. And I think here there's a real opportunity as well for us to get some really big wins within the treaty. If we get reuse right, then a lot of other things will follow as well. So on reuse, for example, one of the things that the UK is advocating for is for us to have some global targets for reuse. This would be probably supplemented through national targets, and I'll explain why we have that global target and national target within it. I think again there's a need to recognize that needs to be some flexibility between countries, and different countries have different approaches. And some of these targets, even within that same waste hierarchy system, actually work against each other. So if you set a recycling target, that might mean that there's an incentive to increase your recycling rates that is at the detriment of a reuse rate, or vice versa. So I think there needs to be that scope of flexibility within that. So we're talking about global targets of reuse overall, supplemented by national targets. And there are loads of different ways in which you can probably start to look at how to achieve some of these targets. Things like, regulatory or economic instruments, public procurement, extended producer responsibility, and then things like incentives to change either the supply chains or to change consumer behavior as well in relation to this. So, sorry, I spoke quite a bit about reuse specifically because I think it's really, really a crucial part of it. But you also mentioned product design and substitution. I think there's a space for for substitution in particular to happen in certain circumstances. I think it's really important that when we look at substitution, either with other materials or with different systems, then we really need to take a very close look at the life cycle of those products and just make sure that we're making an assessment on whether substituting that material in for a plastic material is the right thing to do in that specific context. So this will differ probably between countries, but when we are looking at something which is made of plastic currently, sometimes plastic is the best item for that particular use. We need to make sure that whatever we're looking at is also taking into account the other agreements. So we don't want to be going against anything that's in the Paris Agreement. So obviously, if plastic product is responsible for more greenhouse gases, then I think it makes sense then to substitute it with other materials. But in the instances where actually other materials are proving to be, produce greater greenhouse gas releases, then actually in those instances, retaining the plastic product might be the way forward, and thinking of other ways in which to either remove it from the system, redesign it in a way that it's actually proving to be less problematic. that's it. Sorry for the whirlwind stop.
No, thank you so much, Julius. And we'll be now moving forward with the discussion further, and we'll address in detail on the national plans, means of implementation, and we'll discuss more about reuse. And we'll now call forward Mr. Danny Radin Shah, who is a Deputy Permanent Representative and part of the Indonesian delegation. Mr. Danny, are you there?
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, we will open our quick chat, really addressing your reflections from INC-4. Can you give us kind of an overview of those? That would be great.
Well, thank you. First of all, I think this webinar is very timely because as Jyoti mentioned, we maintain the momentum. And one thing I did after I come back to Nairobi, I scanned the internet and I scanned LinkedIn. I want to see all the coverage of INC-4, and I think I understand the sentiment. Many of the stakeholders are still not very satisfied, and some of them still say that there is some progress, but it's not enough. But I think from my side, I just want to say it from the half glass full perspective, because I think what we have received, what we have achieved in Ottawa was nothing of taken for granted, because it, really tough negotiation, and I really appreciate all the contribution, all the cooperation from all delegates. Being myself as a co-facilitator, I really was sensitive about the temperature of the room, really sensitive about when the delegation got confused a little bit on the discussion. But I think we got a very good streamlined text. It's still far from conclusion, but it's progressing, because now we really get a text, and I think it's a good basis for further discussion. And I think we will get there. We will get there. I think that's my very brief personal reflection. Back to you, Marta.
Thank you so much, Danny. Yeah, and we do have a very specific point of question. As you were also one of the co-facilitators of the contact groups, some of the discussions that we understood that you've had covered the topic of national plans and implementation plans, and specifically taking into the account the diverse national circumstances and capabilities. Can you give us the perspective from the Indonesian side, and also what else you've heard overall?
Thank you. So since INC-1, Indonesia has been consistent in advocating a bottom-up approach, where the national action plan would be the backbone for implementation of this instrument. We are of the view that we should not work from square one in implementing this instrument when it is adopted. Instead, we need to maximize the already existing tools at our disposal, namely national policy, national priorities, rules and regulations, which are relevant, of course, to the effort in ending plastic pollution. And based on those existing tools, we can then develop a national action plan or national implementation plan. It depends on the wording later on, to guide our policy and action in addressing the plastic pollution, to end plastic pollution, including in the marine environment. Just to give you an example, in Indonesia, we already have that. We have a regulation from the Ministry of Environment, where we already provide us like a clear timeline for waste reduction target by 30% by producers in 2029, based on the baseline that is provided. So I think, in our view, each party shall develop and implement this national plan based on, of course, national circumstances and respective capabilities. And this national plan should be country-driven, and then we should make this in a, what do you say, a measurable and achievable manner. And then from time to time, party may also formulate, incorporate new elements in their national plan to see how they are moving forward, how they have new capabilities, how they want to add new ambitions, etc. And I think based on that national implementation plan or national action plan, then we submit it to the secretariat and to make it public, so that we can learn from each other, So that's how we see the important role of national action plan in this context of implementing the instrument. And I think one more thing, Martha, it's also important for developing countries to be supported, to receive support in developing and implementing their national action plan, whether it is technical assistance, financial assistance, technology transfer, all that relevant support, so that the developing countries can really develop and implement a sound national action plan to implement this instrument. I'll leave it at that. Back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danny. And now we'll move forward to our next speaker today, Ms. Anama Salova, a lead negotiator on behalf of Samoa and IOSIS. Hello, Anama. So earlier today, we've heard from the Federated States of Micronesia, who've mentioned financing and financial mechanism as one of the key priorities. We know that Samoa has supported Brazil, Switzerland, the US, Ghana on behalf of the African group, as well as the Latin American and Caribbean group, GRULAC, with a proposal to establish an ad hoc open-ended expert working group that is specifically mobilizing on implementation of the instruments related to the financial mechanism. So we're hoping to learn today is specifically from you, you can tell us a little bit more about kind of key priorities of this ad hoc open-ended expert working group, the proposal, and what do you think can happen during the intersessional work right now on our way towards Busan?
Webinar. It's quite a privilege to speak to the webinar today. So as Samoa, as chair of AOSIS, or the Alliance of Small Island States, with a membership of 39 member countries, has been negotiating as a group throughout the INC process, including an INC-4. And as was mentioned by Dennis from FSM, financing is one of those key elements that the group is working towards in the negotiation process. So financing was a key issue being discussed at INC3 when the committee was considering topics for intersessional work program. Unfortunately, a mandate for intersessional work was not to be during the last intersessional period. So hearing Danny mentioned today about things not being taken for granted, it exactly is that in terms of the regard that we have for this work stream being agreed to at INC-4 as a priority for intersessional work, or for intersessional work being that it is a priority for a lot of the members of the INC. We saw this with a number of informal discussions being held bilaterally and between groups, even before we got to Ottawa, as members flagged priorities, or their priorities for the intersessional period with each other, and right up until that final plenary session in Ottawa. So we saw there were differing views on how and what this particular work stream would focus on and how it would contribute to supporting the work of the committee. So in terms of the question, I can speak to the priorities of AOSIS, of our membership in relation to intersessional work around financing. So as a group, the Small Island Developing States we consider options around financing as presented in the revised draft text. We've articulated for a while the elements that a financial mechanism must include in order for the instrument to be effective and inclusive of SIDS. That being that there must be sufficient and sustainable finance with priority access for Small Island Developing States based on priority areas for SIDS in implementing the instrument, and coupled with strong reporting requirements on the provision of finance. So in the lead up to INC-4, AOSIS had developed an intersessional work proposal that included financing as one of the 3 work streams that were put forward as priorities for Small Island Developing States. So in terms of what we look to achieve over the next intersessional period, AOSIS will continue to engage with others through the agreed work program, the modalities that it will, or forms that it will take between now and Busan, to continue to assess options for financing to address plastic pollution and facilitate discussions on governance, operationalization, functions, and resource mobilization from a variety of sources, including both public and private. So these, for our group at least, are the key priorities during this intersessional period with this mandated work program. And we understand that there are several different ideas of what and how this financing will take form with this treaty. And it'll be through the work during this intersessional period of this open-ended working group that we progress and come to find a way forward towards Busan. So, thanks.
Thank you so much, Ms. Salofa, and thank you for all your insights on the financial mechanism. We'll be now moving forward to our next speaker today, and the last speaker on the member states panel, Ms. Lark Williams, the lead plastic pollution negotiator for United States. Hi, Lark, how are you? Can you hear us?
Hi, I'm good. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well. Well, I'll jump right to it. So throughout the INC-4 negotiations, we've heard that many governments affirm the need for the plastic agreement to align, but not duplicate, the functions of other UN agreements and frameworks. Could you please share with us kind of high-level perspective of the US State Department on whether and how existing frameworks should be implemented or considered as part of this treaty negotiation?
Absolutely. So, I think this is actually a really great question, and we have so many important models for multilateral agreements that we can draw on in thinking about our work. But I think, before we have to answer that question, we have to really understand plastic pollution as a problem. Plastic pollution is so unique among several environmental issues, and, you really see this coming through in the negotiations. Plastic is a product. It's developed with chemical additives that are added for specific performance targets, and it is pervasive in our daily lives. Everybody is either wearing, touching, within something related to plastic. And so, it's clear to me in looking at this instrument and how we're intersecting that level of complexity is coming through. And it's, I think we can draw on many other multilateral environmental agreements, but this is so different in ways like from the Mercury Treaty, which is a single chemical sort of in a specific applications, or the Montreal Protocol, which is a more limited set of chemicals and a more limited set of applications. It doesn't have this sort of really influx and throughout our daily lives. And so that means because of that level of complexity, I think, countries are really starting to wrestle with some of these paradigmatic differences that Christina noted. How do you tackle the upstream and develop obligations that are going to be meaningful and lead to effective changes? How do you think about a financial mechanism that's really going to help support countries most in need? So there's a lot of things that I think we need to sort of consider and can draw on. And I think the chair, the secretariat, the co-facilitators like Danny and others have really helped us make, some good progress on this. But I do think it is important that we sort of look to some of these models. One of the things that really struck me is this sort of the call for science that we continue to hear as a drumbeat. I don't know that it's the marquee issue, but every time we talk to people, it's very clear that science really needs to inform the work that we're doing. It needs to inform future decision-making in the instrument. And I think, we're hearing sort of calls for scientific subsidiary bodies. And I think, that's something we're going to have to wrestle with, is how do we design those? When I think about an instrument like the Montreal Protocol, it sort of has this really amazing set of scientific subsidiary bodies that help it inform its work. And so I think, we might want to look there to sort of think about some of those things. I think there are other instruments that sort of have found a way to sort of bridge the divide for some of these really complex issues. in terms of, you know, wanting to have this balance of being able to sort of have countries have some ability to prioritize as we sort of start to, I think, really move away from so much heavy use of plastic products, and to think about how can we find more circular approaches? How can we incentivize action throughout all levels of society, starting with the very local community levels through, you know, through the international level and at national government. So, you know, in some ways, I think there's just much that we can draw on. One of the things that always strikes me is that, for example, the Paris Agreement limited obligations, but has driven tremendous public interest in climate change, you know, through its regular drumbeat of COPs and sort of, you know, finding a focal point for people to come together and to rally for action on climate change. So there really is a lot out there for us to be thinking about in terms of different multilateral agreements. I wanted to reflect actually a little bit on some of the things that previous speakers have said, because I think in this process, you know, it might be coming through, but I want to emphasize, like, my colleagues have been really clear, like, because this issue is so complex and our time is so limited, we are really at this amazing sort of touchstone or milestone in the negotiations of sort of having a text that lays out a lot of views. We've made substantial progress, but we haven't been able to sort of get through as much of the text as I think we would have wanted. And it puts us in a really important spot as we sort of look to how we're going to make this bridge to Busan, which I love the name of that declaration. I think there's a lot to be said for really thinking how we build bridges. And I think that bridge is sort of a great touchstone for how we build bridges amongst these divergent views. Like, we do have to find a way to overcome sort of divergent views related to the upstream parts of this instrument. And I think the fact that we've agreed to formal intersessional work that's broad enough that we can sort of pull on different threads. And I think, you know, the United States and several other governments were really interested in sort of expanding the scope of that work to be not just related to criteria, but also looking at non-criteria approaches that would enable us to have a much broader conversation, to thinking about, you know, what is it that we can do? And I think, you know, I think it's telling that we picked plastic products as a focal point, because in some ways that really touches on every part of the life cycle, you know, from the far upstream to the far downstream, and sort of is a great inception point for thinking about, you know, how we enhance recyclability, reusability. So, you know, from our perspective, that does give us a pretty broad mandate to sort of start to really think critically about how we can bridge these divides. And to, you know, I think one of the things that we're going to see come out of that is sort of thinking about, you know, elements like EPR, which have a really strong role to play in sort of the solutions that we're coming upon. So I really don't want to undersell it. Governments are under a tremendous amount of pressure as we go into 2024, because this deadline is so tight. And, you know, I think all of us, and you're hearing it come through from my colleagues, are thinking about how we're going to solve this problem. And, you know, the UK has done a tremendous amount of work in sort of presenting us with like a set of notional criteria that we can start to think about and build on and consider as national governments. So, you know, I'm really excited, but I think there is a lot of work to do. So I'm sorry, I took that in a little bit of a different direction, but I'm happy to sort of have my...
No problem. Lark, I think you've covered quite a bit of what we were hoping to touch base on today. I think you have some questions in the chat. You might have a look at it. In the meantime, we have to get moving with the stakeholder dialogue, and we'll hand it over here to Dave Ford, Opulent founder. Dave, please take it away.
Hey, everyone. How are you today? Really excited to bring up our stakeholder dialogue panelists. We have Stuart Harris from ICCA and the American Chemistry Council. We have Rory Cronin from Unilever, Tricia Farrelly representing the Scientists Coalition, and Graham Forbes, who is the global campaign lead at Greenpeace. So thanks so much. And just wanted to say thank you again to all of our member state speakers who just came up before. We really appreciate everything. So Stuart, can we bring you up first?
Sure, happy to. Hey, Dave.
Hey, Stuart, how are you?
Doing well. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it. So let's dig in. So intersessional work is happening. financial mechanisms, plastic products, chemicals of concern in plastic products, product design, reusability, and recyclability have been approved in scope for these discussions. So, wonder if you could outline for us ICCA's position on transparency requirements that are related to chemicals of concern in plastic products, and what are the obstacles and opportunities there?
Yeah, happy to, Dave, and appreciate it. As you know, and hopefully as folks on the line know, after INC-2, we really heard the calls from government to increase transparency on the use of chemical additives in plastics. And so ICCA undertook a project. We are continuing to move through that project it's a database project. So taking information, publicly available information that's available on where chemicals are being used in plastics, where those chemicals are being regulated. Many of them are used in other purposes besides additives, and kind of putting all that together into a single place where governments and others can have access to it. In addition, we also have been working with our members to survey members to identify what chemical additives are still used in commerce. We know, looking back the last 10 years, there have been a lot of advances, a lot of innovations in plastics. And so some of the chemical additives that were used previously are no longer being used. And so trying to also get a handle on that. In terms of opportunities and challenges, we think this is a great opportunity to be sharing information across governments and to create a place where governments can come to one central location to identify and better understand, especially if they don't have a chemical management system, where these chemicals additives are being used, where they're presently regulated, and so creating opportunities for regulatory cooperation for those countries that don't yet have a chemical management system, but also reinforcing and encouraging the need for governments to develop chemical management systems. That's the foundation for all of these issues in terms of understanding what chemicals are being used in commerce in a certain country, how they're being used, and making sure that we've got that information and there's an understanding of where they're regulated. In terms of challenges, there has been a challenge in kind of pulling all this information together. A lot of it is available, but it is in the REACH database, or it's in other databases that are kind of scattered and not necessarily easily accessible. And then, of course, the additional information on what is still being used in commerce is also challenging to find. So really looking for ways that we can address some of those opportunities. And in conversations that we've had with UNEP and with governments throughout the INC process, we're also learning, and I think both a challenge and an opportunity is, how can we make this information, how can we make the database better to address the concerns that we're hearing, not just from governments, but also from the public.
Thanks, Stuart. Appreciate that. And I don't know if there's a link that you can share that other people could take a look at, but that could be helpful. Wanted to jump in on the financial side of things too. So there was a lot of time during INC-4 that were dedicated to defining a pathway toward an effective financial system for the treaty. So can you give us a sense of what features the ICCA thinks a good system should have?
So, yes, and when looking at finance, we kind of break it into two big buckets. Obviously there's sustainable finance to drive circularity, which we would think more in the EPR or EPR-like systems. And there was a lot of discussion about that. I think we've heard on the call today, there's a tremendous amount of convergence across governments, across the private sector, the plastics value chain as well. And we think there's a great opportunity for the agreement to really provide additional support and momentum around getting EPR or similar systems established, which can help not only provide that sustainable financing, but also drive policy decisions that are happening upstream at the design phase of plastics. And then there's the kind of more traditional fund that is often associated with multilateral environmental agreements like this. We do expect that there will be some type of a fund. We've heard the call from governments really increasing the urgency and the need to do that, and think this additional time and intersessional work will be well spent. But beyond the traditional government to government financing mechanism, there's a real opportunity here to create some language or to create an opportunity to pull in investment and funding from the private sector. And we've seen a lot of efforts along those lines, the Circulated Capital Fund, the Lombard ODA Fund, the Alliance to End Plastic Waste, and many others that are looking to try to identify ways where you can attract private sector investment, whether it's from financial institutions, whether it's from industry or elsewhere, and figuring out a way that governments can craft language really to attract that financing. The key piece is going to be creating the enabling policy environment. So the fund discussion can't be held in a vacuum. It's got to be connected to the other pieces, to the design discussion, to the problematic plastic applications discussion, obviously to the EPR discussion and so on, so that as governments are implementing this agreement, the policy levers are in place that then allow investment from the private sector to move into this space.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Stuart. We really appreciate your feedback. Yeah, thanks again. We're gonna pull up Mr. Rory Cronin from Unilever next. How are you, Rory?
Very good, Dave. How you doing? Thanks for having me.
No, really grateful to have you here. So, can you share with us Unilever's perspective on virgin plastic reduction and what are the biggest obstacles on the way to reduction targets?
Okay, so I guess to start off with, at Unilever, we've reduced our virgin plastic footprint by 18% since 2019, and this has been really driven by lightweighting, moving to alternative materials and formats, including exiting polymers entirely like EPS and PVC in our packaging, and also significantly increasing our use of PCR, or post-consumer resin, which now makes up about 22% of our portfolio. It's been a big lift. A lot of assumptions were kind of baked in when we set out our targets initially. Things like development of new technologies and infrastructure, they just haven't materialized as quick as we needed them to be going, faster and stronger. And I think, just like a number of previous speakers have said, we know as a business that reducing virgin plastic remains the single most impactful way of tackling plastic pollution. And I guess our progress shows that it is possible to move away from virgin plastic while still growing as a commercial entity. And I think that's quite an important message. But what we've seen from INC-4 is how the treaty will address virgin plastic production issue. It remains unclear. And the same can be said for how the treaty will tackle reuse and refill models. And I know Dr. Julius from the UK touched on that earlier. That said, we're really encouraged to see the growing momentum behind reduction policies, including the proposal from Rwanda and Peru that's already been mentioned. And I think that the mandate for intersessional work on products and chemicals of concern is critical, and it's something Unilever and the business coalition of which we're a part were calling for. But as Chris said at the very beginning, with a few months to go, it's still not clear what that intersessional work is going to look like and what the path forward is. So we believe that as a business coalition, as Unilever, governments should really prioritise discussions on upstream measures around problematic and avoidable plastic products. And I think the work that the UK and Thailand has does looks really, really interesting. Can't wait to kind of dive into that in a bit more detail. And then the other area is looking at, product design criteria. And that's something our chief exec was in Canada calling for, because that is something that particularly in the consumer goods sector, there is alignment behind packaging design. And I think the treaty can work with the direction of travel when it comes to that kind of upstream measure.
Thank you so much, Rory. We really appreciate it. To try to finish on time, we're moving through, but I think that question right there is definitely what we're hoping to hear, with respect to your position at Unilever and with the business coalition. So just really grateful that you could join us today, and excited to bring up Professor Tricia Farrelly, who is the coordinator for the Scientists Coalition for the Effective Plastics Treaty. She gets bonus stars being in New Zealand and being that it is the absolute middle of the night right now, Tricia. So thank you so much for joining us. And I'm also, for everyone that's not familiar with the Scientist Coalition's work, I'm going to drop a link tree right now in the chat so you can get a sense of everything that that the Scientist Coalition has been doing. If you want to deep dive, maybe out of the gate, Tricia, could you please share with us key goals and objectives of the Scientist Coalition and how the work's being conducted?
Yeah, sure. And thanks, kia ora koutou, and thanks, Dave, for having me here. It's been a really fascinating discussion already. So just to, very briefly, we're all voluntary, all 350 scientists that we have as part of the Scientist Coalition at the moment. We come from over 60 countries, and 60 of us were on the ground in Ottawa. What we're really trying to achieve here, what we've been trying to achieve between INC-3 and INC-4 is to really develop strong rationales for some key working areas. So we've got a number of working groups that we've developed over that period. And the priority for us is on PPP, or the primary plastic polymer reduction targets, but baselines as well. So global baseline and also national baselines and targets. The rationale for that, not necessarily the number, and we've just published something on that just recently. We want to see, we're interested in seeing essentiality criteria based on the essential use concept as applied in the Montreal Protocol, applied through a start and strengthen approach to reduce primary plastic polymers and polymer production. Safety criteria is another priority working area for us. We want to emphasise that needs to be hazard-based, that criteria, and sustainability criteria. We've heard about transparency and traceability, and we have a working group dedicated to that to develop criteria for that. Those are the kinds of working areas we kind of wanted to see in the intersessional period. So we're hoping that we will be able to kind of contribute to those spaces, considering we do offer independent science here. We work really hard, and we worked hard in Ottawa to respond to member states' needs for the scientific consensus, independent scientific consensus. And for example, we have produced some rapid response documents in Ottawa as we've been listening to some of the concerns or miscommunications or confusion around the health impacts of both the chemical and the nanomicroplastics impacts on human health. So we've developed some rapid response documents to try to clear that up. And we've also been working really hard on developing a kind of a view to a sound science policy interface grounded in conflict of interest, both for the intersessional period and for what we hope to see as a subsidiary body under the future instrument as well. And thanks for sharing the link tree, Dave. That's great. All of our outputs are there.
No problem. Tricia, can you summarize quickly and maybe like the sort of high-end bullet points of your findings in the primary plastic polymers urgently needed upstream reduction document that the Scientist Coalition put out?
Yeah, absolutely. And so the paper really emphasizes all the sound science that's already been produced that really leads us to acknowledge that we're seeing plastic pollution in its upward trend, and we really want to emphasize the cumulative and persistent characteristics of plastics here, and this is really the problem. So we're seeing that plastic production will reach at least 20,000 million metric tons by 2040. And that the science is showing us that if we were to reduce plastics by 1 to 3% per annum, this would still fall really well short of ending plastic pollution. And so the paper's really emphasizing that prioritizing the improvement of plastics removal, recycling, that sort of midstream and downstream technologies, if we prioritize those over production reduction, we will never get to the target. We're never going to solve the global plastics pollution crisis. And that we really need to focus on production reduction, and those targets, the PPP or the primary plastic polymer targets, is really where we soundly sit as a scientists coalition to ensure that happens. And again, we've kind of developed a start and strengthen approach too, production reduction led by the essential use concept. Again, that comes from, it has precedent in the Montreal Protocol. And it's also, I think, very useful because I'm hearing some of the speakers talk about, national considerations and context. I'm hearing also, of course, from the UK that, there needs to be some leeway for some of those products that are seen to be, considered unavoidable at this current time. We've developed an approach, at least a starting or thought starter on this, that allows for flexibility for exemptions, but these exemptions for products, but also chemicals and polymers too, would need to be really rigorously assessed by an independent body to ensure that there are no loopholes here, that we all have an even playing field when it comes to regulating plastics production.
Thank you so much, Tricia. We really, really appreciate it. Thanks for staying up so late as well to be a part of this. We're really grateful. So I'd like to bring up our final speaker in this panel, and Mr. Graham Forbes from Greenpeace. Hi, Graham.
Hi, Dave. Thanks for having us.
Our pleasure, our pleasure. So member states decided to move forward with intersessional work on multiple areas, but not primary polymer production. So what are Greenpeace's current recommendation for addressing PPP in the treaty text?
Yeah, well, thanks, Dave. And just to be clear, I think we would just want everyone to understand that reducing plastic production is the single most important thing that this treaty must deliver. And unfortunately, at INC-4, we failed to deliver the program of intersessional work that helps us have the conversation around how we do that. And so I think listening to this conversation here, we are almost having a fake conversation about what needs to be done. We are so far from anything that could be considered circular. Just listening to people mention that word is highly problematic. And I think it feels a bit like we're at risk of almost suffering Stockholm syndrome, where the fossil fuel industry sort of holds the world hostage based on their quest to profit with impunity, while and then we sort of pretend that these downstream measures are going to address the fundamental problem. And so we hope that for countries in the European Union, the High Ambition Coalition, the United States, that INC-4 would be a wake-up call for the fact that this strategy of sort of playing to the lowest common denominator and trying to get agreement is going to get us what we need in terms of addressing and delivering the mandate in Resolution 514. And so from our perspective, the core ingredient that we're going to need to see as we head to Busan is really a renewed political will from the Biden administration, from political leaders around the world to step up and say, we can set global rules that unlock new economic models, unlock innovation in the way that it needs to be done so that we can start to actually address the problem.
Thank you, Graham. Appreciate that. There's also, a core piece of the Breakthrough from Plastic movement and Greenpeace movement has been raising awareness on the strong linkage between plastics, health, and safety concerns. Can you share recommendations on how this treaty text should address not only environmental protection, but also safeguard human health?
Yeah, I think, everybody talks about the plastics crisis is at the core of the triple planetary crisis around climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. But I think as you're pointing out, and as Tricia and the Scientist Coalition can tell you, it's a threat to human health at a scale that's almost unimaginable in terms of it just leaching into our bodies just more and more. Every week there's new studies that show how disastrous that would be. And I think, we've seen we need to get to the volumes in terms of reducing the total amount that we produce. And we also need to address the, 16,000 plus toxic chemicals that are virtually unregulated internationally. And so from our perspective, again, it's in the zero draft. The options are there in the text. We can set a global target. We can have mandatory contributions. We can regulate the chemicals, have an annex and all those things. The framework is there. These aren't legal questions. These are political questions. And it comes back to, is there going to be the political will to deliver these things? And, INC-4, we didn't get there, right? Like it was a disaster. And so we have to see renewed political sort of engagement on how we do this, because I think the thing is, it's not whether or not we need to reduce plastic production and address the toxic chemicals. It's much more of like, how are we going to do that? And unfortunately, the bulk of the treaty negotiations have focused downstream. We have not had the time and the space to talk about upstream measures. We need to talk about the how. And we can do it. I believe in innovation, and markets can solve this, but we have to focus on the how, and we just haven't had time for that. And so one of the things we're going to be looking for is for countries that are really serious. We don't have formal intersessional work, but we can do informal sessional work. You know, sort of France did a really important thing in the lead up to INC-4. We need more informal intersessional work on plastic production. So by the time we get to Busan, we have the information, the data that we're going to need to make these tough choices.
Thank you so much, Graham. We really appreciate it. We want to thank all of our stakeholder panelists today. We thank you so much and for staying with us and sharing your POVs. So the last, certainly not least, a friend of OPLN since its inception, Mr. Yoni Shireen with Systemic is going to give a stakeholder keynote on their plastic treaty futures report that they just put out. Yoni?
Thanks, David. Thanks so much. Thanks for inviting me. Yeah, it's a real honor to be here and to go after all those amazing speakers and those fantastic presentations. I'm also conscious of time, so I'll try to do my best. It was planned to be for 10 minutes. I'll try to do it really quick because I assume that people have to run to other meetings. For those who don't know me, my name is Yoni Shiran. I work at Systemic, who is a B Corporation working on the system changes that are needed to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals and working towards a more circular and regenerative economy. We've been doing a lot of research, and here we're doing research specifically on the treaty, trying to model different scenarios for the treaty to help inform negotiators of the economic, environmental, and social implications of different treaty options. Sorry if I'm speaking a bit quickly. I'm just trying to do it as quickly as possible so you can all get to your next meeting. If you go to the next slide, the purpose of this work that was just published just before INC-4 is exactly as I was saying, to inform negotiators by modeling the environmental, economic, and social ramifications of 4 different treaties scenarios for the treaty, which were designed and inspired by country positions. And we think this is important because the Zero Draft and all the other documents put out by the INC are fantastic documents to frame the discussions, but they don't give out quantitative analysis of the impact of different treaty options. And we think this is important for negotiators to as they negotiate. So in the briefest of ways, I'll take you through some of the findings of the work. If you go to the next slide, we have split the scenarios across 2 main dimensions, which we think are the fundamental dimensions that have been discussed over the last 4 INCs. And even today in this session, we heard a lot about that. One dimension around the scope of action. So will it be a full life cycle treaty, or will it focus downstream only? That's the first dimension there on the y-axis. And then the other dimension is a degree of coordination. Will it be a bottom-up kind of national action kind of treaty that is non-binding, kind of without binding targets and guidelines, or will it be global action based on consensus on regulation and ambition? It doesn't mean that all countries need to have the same targets, but at least there is a global action and global alignment. If you go to the next slide, this one has quite a bit of detail, so I won't take you through everything. I'll give you the link to the report at the end if you want to take a look. But essentially, we've identified 15 policies on the left-hand side, which is what we call the full life cycle scenario. So this is the treaty version, the ambitious treaty version in our view, where we would implement these global rules, these 15 global rules, universally. And then any downstream scenario, so the downstream only scenarios have waste management only, so only the left-hand side of the chart. In the interest of time, I won't take you through details, but essentially the 15 policies encounter all the life cycle, including all the policies that have been discussed here today. Of course, EPR and reuse mandates and recycling mandates, collection targets, and so on, but also all the upstream stuff, including virgin plastic production reduction targets, and application of lots of levers to curb down plastic production and consumption. I want to get to the results, so I won't give you much more detail on this, if that's okay. I'll take you now through the 4 main findings that we have. The first one is on the next slide, and possibly the most important, which is a coordinated full life cycle treaty is needed, because that is the only version of the treaty that will meaningfully get us to reducing plastic pollution in accordance to the 514. I will show you the numbers in a second, but from the 4 scenarios that we talked about, it's only the version that has the full life cycle scope, and one that has a top-down treaty that has global rules. That is the only scenario, based on our modeling at least, that would deliver that mandate. If you look at the numbers on the next slide, the way to read the charts is on the left, you have 2019. This chart essentially shows end of life fate of plastic waste. So on the left, you have 2019 numbers, and the red there at the bottom is how much plastic is mismanaged today. So it's approximately 30% mismanaged plastic today. And then you can see the BAU scenario is the one that follows, and the 4 scenarios on the right are the 4 scenarios that we modeled. And essentially, without taking you through all the details in this chart, you see that only the scenario in the far right has a significant reduction in the red bucket, that is the mismanaged plastic waste. The other scenarios, including ambitious action at national level without this global coordination, all these scenarios lead to a reduction of plastic pollution, but not enough, according to our analysis, to really end plastic pollution by 2040, as I think countries are aspiring to do. If you look at the next slide, from a greenhouse gas perspective implication, here too we see that only the global full life cycle scenario is the one that meaningfully reduces greenhouse gases. The other scenarios do have a reduction, but certainly not enough. The global full life cycle scenario is the only one that keeps greenhouse gas emissions flat. This clearly isn't enough either, is not aligned with the Paris Agreement, so we need to go even further down, but that will require additional policies to decarbonize the plastic system that are beyond the scope of this analysis. Okay, so that was the first finding around what kind of treaty we need at the high level. The second finding is, on the next slide, please, is looking at inaction and the cost of that. And as you would not be surprised to hear, inaction is costly. In fact, it's very costly. By our measures, if you look at the public sector cost of a business as usual scenario, that would be $200 billion more expensive than this scenario that we're talking about, kind of globally coordinated scenario. And that is simply because of the case that if you have so much plastic production and so much plastic waste, that drives a lot of waste, a lot of cost to the public sector. We can look at the numbers on the next slide, but essentially governments would have to deal with collecting and managing and disposing all this waste. So in the business as usual scenario, we have a $1.7 trillion cost over 15 years. You can see the cost in the different scenarios, but the scenario at the bottom, the global full life cycle scenario, has the 1.5 trillion over the same period, which essentially is a $200 billion reduction for the public sector. So we think that should be incentive also for governments to adopt this ambitious scenario. So that was finding number 2. Finding number 3 is that financing mechanisms are critical, because even though there's a net reduction of cost for the public sector under the scenario, the costs are not equal across all regions of the world, and particularly in the global south, where a lot of infrastructure needs to be developed and built, that will cost money. And so there is a net cost in the global south. If we look at the numbers on the next slide, we've done lots of analysis on the financial, on the financing side, all of which you can find in the report. The one slide I'll show you today is we have a total requirement of $950 billion under the global full life cycle scenario. That's the second bar there from the left, which compares to 900 billion in the BAU. Sorry, this is for the global south only. So this is low and middle income countries. So for these countries in the global south, the global full life cycle scenario is $50 billion more expensive. If we maintain the current levels of spending and we extrapolate it out to 2040 and account for inflation and all the rest of it, governments would spend approximately 650 billion. So the key number, if there's one number you remember from here, is there's a funding gap of $300 billion over this 15-year period. This $300 billion is what is, separating us from the infrastructure that we need in the global south to collect and manage waste to ensure it doesn't leak to the environment, including reuse infrastructure and everything we need across the life cycle. This $300 billion is essentially order of magnitude of the amount of money that the global south would need from the treaty or from some mechanism to develop the infrastructure that we need to deliver the scenario. And the last finding on the next slide is that any fears of economic dislocation are misplaced, because across all regions of the world, according to our analysis, there is a net growth of economic activity and new value pools are created that more than offset the limited declines that we see in plastic production in this scenario. So if you look on the next slide, we've tried to model the value pools in different scenarios. This is the high-level summary. So the columns there, the columns are the different parts of the value chain, and the rows represent the different scenarios. I won't take you through all the numbers, but essentially, if you compare the BAU scenario that has a big value pool of primary production of plastics, but also and relatively small value pools for everything else, and you compare that to the last row, which is around the global full life cycle scenario, you see a much more balanced system where a lot more value pools are driven for recycling, but also substitution into new materials, and also reuse and other new delivery models there in dark blue. A net of $600 billion of net new value pools, according to our analysis, that could be created under the scenario. So these were the main findings. I know I went through it super fast, but hopefully it gives you a taste. On the last slide, you have the QR code if you want to look at the full report, and you also have my email there. We do have a few tools online. If you go into the QR code, you can see the regional analysis. You can see all of this analysis and data and a lot more by regions, 9 different regions across the world. And also there's a scenario explorer tool where you can build your own scenario and play with different assumptions for what different ambition levels, different regions would sign up to, and what impact that would have on all these KPIs. I hope you found that useful. I'm happy to continue the conversation over email or anywhere else. Thank you so much, Dave and Marta, for the opportunity, and back to you.
Thanks so much, Yoni. We really appreciate it. Thanks for going through that. Thank you to everyone for being here today. We are just so grateful to be able to hold these global treaty dialogues. We've been doing this since before UNEA 5.2. And we are going to be doing it to the end. And we're just incredibly grateful for our partners, SAPs, for making this possible. And we're just grateful to be able to bring all sides of the table together to learn from each other in these forums. So on behalf of Marta, Megan, and the entire OPLN team, thank you so much. And just have an incredible rest of your day. And looking forward to Busan. Here we come. Thanks.